Now I'm going to read a quote from Eliot. He says, "The other argument to which I refer is of a similar sort. It is founded upon the words in Genesis 1:26, 'Let us make man in our image after our likeness,' which we also regard as an idiomatic mode of expression commonly called the plural of excellence or of dignity." End quote. What we see there is that, it's a common expression. It's idiomatic, and it's called the plurality of excellence or plurality of dignity. It's simply referring to the extreme dignity or power or majesty or excellence of a ruler, of one in power, and God is the ultimate power. And Eliot goes on and he says, "We might quote other passages showing the same use of the plural, but it is not needful, as the argument is abandoned by a large part of Trinitarian writers. Martin Luther, Grotius, Bishop Patrick, Dr. South, Dr. Samuel Johnson, Archbishop Whately are all good Orthodox authorities, and all of them agree with us upon this point." End quote. So there are even eminent Trinitarians. Martin Luther abandoned the inference that God is spoken of and represented as a multitude of persons in the 3 or 4 verses where plural pronouns are used, or even in the word Elohim. That argument is simply given up. And keep in mind that it's admitted and even endeavored to be explained why the doctrine of the Trinity is not in the Old Testament specifically. And this is one of the contradictions that you find with trying to understand this doctrine of the Trinity. So many Trinitarians admit it's not in the Old Testament. Some admit it's not even in the Bible, but others admit, well, it wasn't revealed unto Israel, all right? It didn't come, the Trinity wasn't revealed until the day of Pentecost. But then what do we find? We find people trying to argue from the Old Testament. And look, it's either there or it's not. If it's not, abandon trying it. And what we find is that people like Martin Luther and others did just that. They didn't endeavor to try to find a plurality of gods in the few places in the Old Testament where God is represented by a plural pronoun, especially when we see kings in the Old Testament. King Rehoboam represented in the plural. Now, Charles Morgridge is going to comment on the plural pronouns that are commonly used. It's common to use plural pronouns for an individual. He says, "If therefore we consider," says Mr. Yates, "how common throughout the world has been the use of plural pronouns to express the dignity and authority of the speaker, and that in the scriptures this phraseology is employed by a prophet, an apostle, or a prince, we cannot be surprised that in 3 instances the King of Kings should employ the same majestic language. The wonder is that the examples are so rare. Perhaps this form of expression was in general studiously avoided in order to preserve the great doctrine of the unity of God in one person from the possibility of misapprehension." End quote. And certainly, if God is his plurality of persons, it really, truly, 3 persons in one, it's a marvel that in only 4 cases are plural pronouns employed in describing him. I mean, we're left to collect from these tiny little traces in the Old Testament. It doesn't even happen in the New. Just these traces in the Old Testament that this all fundamental doctrine of God's threeness and plurality of persons, we're left to collect it from 4 verses in the Old Testament. That's absurd. And he goes on. He says, "A plurality of persons, when speaking of themselves, never say I, me, mine, myself. There is no rule or custom known among men to justify such a style. Yet God always speaks of himself in the use of the singular pronouns, except in 3 or 4 cases. This proves beyond all debate that God is but one individual person. One person can say we, our, us, but a plurality of persons cannot say I, my, me, myself." End quote. And that's very right. It is common, and we know this, we're familiar with this, that people in authority will say, "We are going to retire now," when referring to themselves. But it's not common when 5 guys get together and say, "I'm going to play basketball," referring to all 5. All right? So bear that in mind. God throughout the scripture refers to himself, except in 3 or 4 cases, in the singular. And so it just establishes that God is one person, and that's exactly what we would expect. That's exactly how the scripture teaches us about God, that there's one supreme, self-existent God. So it just